So, what is culture? Culture is an operating system, and what I mean by that is that just like you would have in any sort of computer or mobile phone, you have some kind of software that controls sort of all the hardware, and that's done by an operating system. And so, if you think about your life, your society, your family, your country, your nation as being sort of a part of the hardware, there is a software that sort of permeates or sort of superimposes itself on top of that. That's the OS, that's the operating system. And so it really does define almost everything you see, hear, taste, feel, and think. That's why when you get a grasp of using culture for IELTS, it's really beneficial because you can put just about any IELTS topic somewhere underneath the culture umbrella as long as you use the right discourse markers, referring them to being subjective about what it is you want to do with this topic or the idea that they try to present with you. And so one of the challenges that you're going to have is that it's such a big topic and it can be very vague sometimes for Cambridge and IELTS that you'll get actually distracted. And so you're going to have to do a lot of sort of a personal management in dealing with cultural questions. And we'll look at some of the samples because just about everything fits in this garage, so to speak. And so your culture is ancient, although much has been forgotten, as happens with ancient cultures, where we tend to think of Western culture as a newer type of operating system. And so learning English allows you to merge cultures or operating systems. And we know that basically when you learn any sort of language, you're going to adapt some of those things in your personality, in your way of thinking, and so forth. And for IELTS, it's better to try to adapt to or adjust to their sort of operating system. And we said that way back in the beginning when we started all of this about 6 weeks ago. We said we do have to try to push ourselves into thinking in sort of the international English language testing system to get our mind into that sort of mindset and think about giving answers that would somehow give us some control over those topics. And when we can't do that, we need to provide the signal, the discourse marker, or the transition language to let the examiner know that, okay, I don't know exactly about this. I don't know enough about this. Maybe I'll have to guess about this. But here's how I see it from my perspective, in my opinion, what I think, what I believe. And so for the last few weeks, we've been trying to develop those sort of topic areas so that you have something to say about any topic that they throw at you. And so that way you're not at a loss or you're surprised or taken back. Because examining as much as I did, I found out a lot of times that even when people had the lexical resource, they had the vocabulary, they did not have enough of the critical thinking or enough of the ability to be flexible with their ideas to deal with topics that caught them by surprise and that would just whoosh, cut their fluency, just knock them right down. And so we got to get over that. And so by looking at culture in sort of an active way, in a fun way, in a way that says, okay, I just need to put in these few little signals, then I can just do about almost anything I want to do with this because there really is no right or wrong answer because it's everything. And so ultimately, I'd have to say, if that's the case, that culture itself is not your friend. And the reason why I say it's not your friend is because do you own it or does it own you? And that's a decision you have to make for yourself, especially when you're younger, because you're still, a victim of a lot of the forces of culture and social pressures that get put onto you by your school, by your parents, by society, by the collective culture of China itself. And so trying to engage in that in a way that is at 6.5, 7, and above definitely needs some sort of flexibility or understanding. And so this will be another week of sort of self-examination, of looking at your values, looking at what you believe, and then trying to apply all the other pieces that you put into this over the last few weeks in language in order to say things that have some sort of substance or meaning or value in the exam. And also when you later on go on to your universities and you do your presentations or you're talking to your colleagues or your instructors, that you can sort of have confidence to manage that. And hopefully, this also translates into the writing when you separate the components between descriptive grammar, how we speak casually, rapid, fast, just adding ideas until people go, oh, okay, I don't know. as opposed to prescriptive grammar when we have to make sure that we're hitting those formats and components directly with the things that have to happen for prescribed grammar rules. And so that's all really important. So going down the cultural pathway here, I've got some notes from a previous student. Don't worry, when these go into WeChat, they'll be easier for you to read and to understand. What? You can't hear me? Am I just talking for no reason? Pump up the volume. Pump it up. It's because your bandwidth is not wide enough. Are you there? Oh, that's the pit. I can hear you, but you can't hear me. That's a bummer. Is that true? Yep, you can't hear me. Great. I love it when I'm glad I recorded it because I can do it again. All right, log in, log out. I told them to put it on a different server, and they never listened. So when they do it, they turn the volume up all the way, so it's all feedback. Right. And so then you mute it, and then what happens is it messes up the bandwidth. Oh, well, let's see, where are we at? Let me rephrase that again. So these are student notes from past class. Your notes may not look like this. That's okay. But basically, you should have something about culture-related vocabulary so you can put that in there when the question specifically is about culture. And so when I send this through WeChat, it'll be a little bit clearer for you, but there's a nice little academic list here dealing with culture, the ways of life, cultured. Always want to look at the different formats of the word as well. So that's following culture, belief, your mental acceptance of what you believe, things like ethics or morals. And so definitely when we talk about some of the cultural diversity, we're going to think about how some of the ethics and morals are different. And again, going back to that idea of having sort of some cultural diversity, of thinking about the culture of IELTS itself in international terms. And so some of the things that you might believe are ethical or not ethical, or moral or not moral, will be very different. And so you got to factor that in when you're telling that to the examiner. And so that's going to be important to use those subjective discourse markers to manage that. Civilization as itself, and so that's one of the reasons why we believe that you guys have a much longer history with culture, is because you've had a longer chance at civilization, 5,000 years, but then you had a kind of a update, a reset in 1949, so a lot of that stuff has sort of been readjusted. And so now we still look back and try to figure some of those ideas out, or in this case, some of the cultural specificities or the specific parts of your culture that shape, the things that are going on with you. What is culturally acceptable? What's culturally acceptable for you as a foreign student? What's culturally acceptable for a foreigner in China? And a lot of times that is the next part here, which is cultural conflicts. And you will constantly be facing cultural conflicts, especially when you go overseas to study, because that's a big part of culture shock. And so that, a lot of it comes out of the extension of cultural stereotypes, the things that we sort of pre-believe or sort of quickly frame in order to sort of understand, what somebody is or somebody isn't. And now, because we're in a much more divisive sort of situation after COVID and the virus, we know that people have these sort of renewed stereotypes that were sort of fading away, and now they're sort of back together again. And so it's our job to sort of break those down, to demonstrate cultural diversity, to show some sort of different type of diverse culture. Even going from Longgong to Fujian, the cultural diversity for Chinese people is, there's a big gap there. There's not a lot of foreigners in Longgong, but compared to Fujian, where there's a lot more. And so the cultural diversity there is definitely wider. Cultural uniqueness. What is unique about your culture? And it's not just about Chinese culture, because some people here are Hakka. They speak Kerjiahua and they speak Guangdonghua and then Putonghua. Some people maybe are Chaozhou or Chaozhounese, and so they have a Chaozhou culture and then maybe Cantonese culture and then maybe Putonghua or mainland culture as well. Cultural misconceptions. And so these are sort of like the confused ideas that we have about other cultures. And so this happens a lot when we're learning about cultures or even talking about them, is that sometimes we'll base our presumptive ideas on these misconceptions. And so a lot of that does have to deal with this idea of culture shock. And for me, being back in America, it's always about reverse culture shock, because living in China for such a long time, where you go through these sort of stages of culture shock of like acceptance and adjustment and all these different little pieces of it. Then it goes back in reverse when you come back to your home country. Even for Chinese people, when students go overseas, what do we call them? We call them sea turtles. And of course, anytime we call anybody a turtle in Chinese, it's an insult. It's a mild one, but it's still sort of, a cheeky way of explaining their situation. So that has to that has to deal with racial behavior. Now, when you ask adults and grandparents in China if there's any racism, they'll tell you no, just flat out no, because they're not aware of it. They have no perception of it. On the other hand, if you ask millennials or younger people, they see it very quickly. They understand some of the racial behavior or racial discrimination that happens between cultures, especially students that go overseas that have to face it. And so local and global culture, hopefully you will sort of err more towards the global culture side when you're talking about it or trying to manage these topics. A little bit about people who emigrate and immigrate, what the difference is. Dialects, of course, as I mentioned earlier, things about Kerjiahua, Guangdonghua, Chaozhouhua, take your pick of different dialects of Chinese. And so it's never one of those things that is so clear to some people from outsiders when you ask them, what's your first language? And they're like, Chinese. Okay, but there's a lot of flavors of dialect of Chinese. And so your first language is when you get in trouble. What language does your mother yell at you in when she's mad? Okay, that's your first language. And so it might be in Kerjiahua, it might be in Guangdonghua, it might be in Chaozhouhua. Depends on where you're at here in the South. Ethnocentrism. And so this is also sort of looking at sort of the ethnocentric areas of culture that are sort of specific and much more I would say centered around certain types of cultures. And Yunnan in far west of China has like 56 minorities. It's a fantastic place to look at different sort of ethno backgrounds and diversity, because they're all sort of individualized cultures, because there's many minorities there that have been separated by the very sort of mountainous and valley regions. Socialization, that's a big part of what we do. We've even said for you guys going from high school to come into Aspire as students, there's some socialization that we're always trying to push. We know that to be effective in communicating in English, you have to be able to socialize. You have to be able to open your mouth, use your confidence, speak, engage people, engage the examiner when you're talking to them in the interview. For some people, that's a big stretch. They have a real hard time with socialization, being much more social. That will definitely advance you in English. Descendant. So we think about our ancestors in China quite often, but sometimes we have to think about you as the descendants. Like what will happen in your generation and in the future, how things will change, how things will shift based on culture or diversity as well. Mores, conventions, taboos, things we do, things we don't in culture, that's all pretty useful. This idea of acculturation, which is acquiring culture. Sometimes it's done in a proprietary way, sometimes it's done in a naive sort of way. And so people sometimes can be very sensitive about that, especially in the West, because they are sort of being a little bit more tribal about their culture now. And so people take that very serious. Assimilation is a big part of what should happen. Ideally, in your host country, even for us as foreigners, there should be some areas of assimilation, but we all know that no matter how much Chinese you speak, even if you get married to a Chinese person, not talking about you, Ilfa, but of course, the idea of assimilation is, you'll never be Chinese. That's the truth of it. You'll always be Uyghur. You'll always be outside people because of the collective nature of China, where 90% people are Han Chinese, because there's a lack of diffusion. Even within your subcultures, people try to sort of get married within subcultural lines. If you're a Kurja person, you're probably going to want to marry another person who's Hakka, and vice versa. Your family is going to encourage it because it's a lot easier for them. And that's why I say culture is not always your friend. It's not always 100%, but it's gotten a lot better over the years. So again, because of the cultural garage, we know that we can park a lot of different things under here. So I've got a couple of sub lists of vocabulary in some places.